Harriet Beecher Stowe was a daughter of New England who became one of the most influential writers in American history through a single powerful novel. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author whose words helped ignite a nation toward civil war, was born in Litchfield, Connecticut on June 14, 1811. She came from a prominent religious family. She had a brilliant mind and a passionate spirit. Stowe's upbringing was steeped in theological debate and moral conviction. She was educated at her sister's school, the Hartford Female Seminary, where she excelled in composition and languages. Then in 1832, her family moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, and the 21-year-old Harriet followed them to this border city where slavery was just across the river in Kentucky. Harriet Beecher Stowe witnessed slavery firsthand in Cincinnati. She saw the human cost of the institution. In 1836, Harriet married Calvin Stowe, a widowed theology professor at Lane Seminary where her father was president. Calvin, along with his modest income, meant Harriet had to work to support their growing family. Stowe began writing stories and essays for magazines and journals. She started to develop her voice as a writer, crafting narratives that explored moral questions and social issues. America felt that slavery, this peculiar institution, was tearing at the fabric of the nation and creating a moral crisis that could not be ignored. Harriet Beecher Stowe was not a radical abolitionist or a William Lloyd Garrison or a Frederick Douglass, any of the fervent activists, if you will, who were leading the anti-slavery movement. She was a more reluctant convert. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to assist in capturing escaped slaves. 1 year later, Stowe began writing what would become Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet was literally the woman at her writing desk who sat down with pen and paper ready to tell a story that would shake the conscience of a nation. In June 1851, the first installment of Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared in the anti-slavery newspaper The National Era. The story was serialized over 10 months. But within weeks of its publication as a book in March 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin became a sensation. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel that touched hearts and changed minds. She used storytelling, narrative power, and emotional truth to make readers see enslaved people as human beings with families and feelings and dignity. Stowe sold 300,000 copies in the first year in America alone. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best-selling book after the Bible. Stowe's strategy was all about making people feel the reality of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin told the story of Uncle Tom, an enslaved man of deep Christian faith who is sold away from his family. The novel followed Tom through multiple owners, showing both the cruelty and the humanity within the slave system. Stowe created unforgettable characters like Eliza, the mother who escapes across the frozen Ohio River clutching her child, and Simon Legree, the brutal plantation owner who becomes the embodiment of slavery's evil. She showed the separation of families, the violence, the sexual exploitation, and the dehumanization that were inherent to slavery. The book sparked enormous controversy. Harriet Beecher Stowe was attacked by Southern writers and politicians who claimed she had misrepresented slavery. They said she didn't know what she was writing about, that she had never lived in the South, that she was spreading lies and propaganda. Stowe responded by publishing A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1853, a book that documented the real cases and sources that had inspired her novel. She proved that every incident in her book was based on actual events and testimonies. Uncle Tom's Cabin had an extraordinary impact on public opinion about slavery. The novel was translated into dozens of languages and read around the world. It was adapted for the stage, and theatrical productions toured throughout the North, bringing the story to people who couldn't read or couldn't afford books. The play became one of the most performed productions in American theater history. In Britain and Europe, the book turned public opinion against the American South and made foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy politically impossible during the Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe became an international celebrity. She traveled to Europe 3 times, meeting with royalty, intellectuals, and reformers. In Britain, she was greeted by massive crowds and received petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of women expressing solidarity with the anti-slavery cause. Stowe used her fame to continue advocating for abolition and to support her family through her writing income. She wrote prolifically, producing novels, essays, and articles on various social issues. The legend says that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862, he greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Whether Lincoln actually said those words is debated by historians, but the sentiment captures the widespread belief that Uncle Tom's Cabin had helped bring about the Civil War. Stowe's novel had crystallized Northern opposition to slavery and made compromise increasingly difficult. It had personalized the abstract political debates about states' rights and property by showing slavery as a human tragedy. During the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe continued to write and advocate for the Union cause. She supported the recruitment of black soldiers and called for complete emancipation. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Stowe celebrated it as a fulfillment of the moral vision she had articulated in her novel. She saw the war as a divine judgment on the sin of slavery, a belief shared by many in the North who interpreted the conflict in religious terms. After the war ended in 1865, Stowe turned her attention to other social issues and continued her literary career. She wrote novels about New England life, drawing on her Connecticut childhood and her observations of changing American society. She explored themes of religion, domesticity, women's roles, and social reform. Her novel The Minister's Wooing examined Calvinist theology and its impact on ordinary people. Old Town Folks depicted small-town New England life with humor and affection. She also wrote Lady Byron Vindicated, defending the poet Lord Byron's widow against accusations, though this book damaged Stowe's reputation because of its scandalous revelations about Byron's personal life. Harriet Beecher Stowe was part of a remarkable family of reformers and intellectuals. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was one of the most prominent Protestant ministers in America. Her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, became perhaps the most famous preacher of his generation, leading Plymouth Church in Brooklyn and speaking out against slavery. Her sister, Catherine Beecher, was an educator and writer who advocated for women's education and domestic science. The Beecher family represented the moral and intellectual energy of 19th-century American Protestantism. Stowe's personal life was marked by both joy and tragedy. She and Calvin had 7 children, but they lost their infant son Samuel to cholera in 1849. This devastating loss deepened Stowe's empathy for enslaved mothers who had their children torn from them. She later wrote that she could understand something of the anguish of slave mothers because of her own grief. Her son Frederick, a Civil War veteran, struggled with alcoholism and disappeared during a voyage to San Francisco, never to be seen again. These personal sorrows informed Stowe's writing and her understanding of human suffering. In her later years, Harriet Beecher Stowe settled in Hartford, Connecticut, and also maintained a winter home in Mandarin, Florida. She continued to write and remained active in literary and social circles. Mark Twain was her neighbor in Hartford, and they became friends despite their very different literary styles and sensibilities. Stowe's final years were marked by declining mental faculties, and she gradually withdrew from public life. She spent her last years in quiet domesticity, cared for by her family. Harriet Beecher Stowe died on July 1, 1896, in Hartford, Connecticut. She was 85 years old. Her funeral was attended by family, friends, and admirers who recognized her as one of the most important American writers of the century. The tributes emphasized her role in the anti-slavery movement and her contribution to American literature. Newspapers across the country published obituaries celebrating her life and legacy. Stowe's legacy is complex and multifaceted. Uncle Tom's Cabin remains one of the most influential novels in American history, a book that demonstrated the power of literature to shape political consciousness and drive social change. The novel helped make slavery a moral issue that could not be compromised away. It gave faces and stories to people who had been treated as property. It mobilized anti-slavery sentiment in the North and created international pressure on the United States to end slavery. However, Uncle Tom's Cabin has also been criticized for its racial stereotypes and its portrayal of black characters. The character of Uncle Tom, meant by Stowe to represent Christian virtue and moral strength, became in later popular culture a term of derision, suggesting servility and accommodation to white supremacy. This transformation of Uncle Tom's meaning shows how cultural interpretation can change over time. Modern scholars debate whether Stowe's novel, despite its anti-slavery message, reinforced certain racist assumptions about black inferiority and the need for white guidance. The theatrical adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which proliferated after Stowe's death and continued into the 20th century, often distorted her original story. These productions, known as Tom shows, frequently emphasized melodrama and spectacle while downplaying the novel's anti-slavery message. Some versions even portrayed slavery in a positive light. These adaptations contributed to the negative connotations that became attached to the Uncle Tom character. Stowe had no control over these theatrical productions and received no royalties from them due to the absence of international copyright protection. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin from the perspective of 19th-century evangelical Christianity. She believed that slavery was a sin against God and that Christian love and moral suasion could overcome it. Her novel appealed to readers' religious sentiments and their sense of Christian duty. This religious framework was both the source of the novel's power and a limitation. Stowe could not imagine a society of racial equality. Instead, she initially supported colonization schemes that would send freed slaves to Africa. Her vision of emancipation was constrained by the racial assumptions of her time. Despite these limitations, Stowe's achievement remains remarkable. She was a woman writer in an era when women's voices were often dismissed or marginalized. She used the tools available to her, the sentimental novel and the language of Christian morality, to intervene in the most pressing political crisis of her time. She demonstrated that domestic fiction, often derided as trivial women's writing, could have profound political consequences. Uncle Tom's Cabin showed that stories about families, homes, and personal relationships could illuminate large social and political questions. Stowe's other writings have received less attention than Uncle Tom's Cabin, but they reveal the breadth of her interests and talents. Her New England novels are valuable portraits of a particular time and place in American history. Her essays on domestic economy and household management contributed to the 19th century cult of domesticity that elevated women's roles as wives and mothers. Her religious writings explored theological questions and the relationship between faith and daily life. She was a versatile and prolific writer who supported her family through her pen for decades. The question of Stowe's relationship to feminism is complicated. She believed in women's moral superiority and their special role as guardians of home and family. She advocated for women's education and women's influence in society. But she did not support women's suffrage or challenge the fundamental gender hierarchies of her time. She worked within the ideology of separate spheres, arguing that women's domestic influence could be a force for social reform. Modern feminists have debated whether Stowe's work advanced or hindered women's equality. Harriet Beecher Stowe understood that for social change to happen, hearts had to be changed as well as laws. She believed in the power of sympathy and emotional connection to overcome prejudice and injustice. Uncle Tom's Cabin was designed to make readers weep, to make them feel the humanity of enslaved people, to make them see slavery as a personal moral issue rather than an abstract political question. This strategy of appealing to emotion and sentiment has been both praised and criticized. Some see it as a powerful tool for social reform, others see it as manipulative and paternalistic. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 came at a critical moment in American history. The Compromise of 1850 had attempted to resolve the conflict between slave and free states, but the Fugitive Slave Act had inflamed Northern opinion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 would further destabilize the political situation by allowing territories to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 would declare that black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Against this backdrop of escalating crisis, Stowe's novel provided a moral framework for understanding slavery as an unmitigated evil that had to be abolished. Stowe's religious faith was central to her identity and her work. She grew up in a household dominated by theological discussion and religious intensity. Her father's Calvinism emphasized human sinfulness and divine sovereignty. Harriet struggled with these doctrines, finding them harsh and unforgiving. She eventually embraced a more liberal theology that emphasized God's love and human free will. This religious evolution is reflected in her novels, which often critique rigid Calvinism while affirming Christian faith. Her belief that slavery was a sin gave her writing moral authority and urgency. The economic success of Uncle Tom's Cabin transformed Stowe's life. Before the novel, she had struggled financially, writing magazine pieces for small payments while raising children and managing a household. After the novel, she was wealthy and famous. The money allowed her to travel, to educate her children, and to live comfortably. But it also brought pressures and expectations. She was now a public figure whose opinions were sought on various issues. She had to navigate the demands of celebrity while continuing to write and maintain her family life. Harriet Beecher Stowe's relationship with Frederick Douglass and other black abolitionists was respectful but complicated. Douglass praised Uncle Tom's Cabin for its anti-slavery impact but also criticized its portrayal of black characters and its suggestion that colonization might be a solution to racial problems. Stowe met with Douglass and other black leaders, and she modified some of her views over time. She came to support full citizenship rights for freed slaves and opposed colonization schemes. But she never fully escaped the racial paternalism of her era. The impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin extended far beyond the United States. In Britain, the novel became a bestseller and influenced public opinion against slavery and later against the Confederacy during the Civil War. British working-class readers identified with the enslaved characters and saw parallels between their own exploitation and that of American slaves. In Europe, the novel was read as an indictment of American hypocrisy and brutality. In Russia, Tolstoy admired the book and was influenced by its moral vision. The novel became a global phenomenon, shaping international perceptions of America and slavery. Stowe's writing style in Uncle Tom's Cabin combined sentimentalism, realism, and melodrama. She used detailed descriptions of domestic life to create a sense of authenticity. She employed emotional appeals and dramatic scenes to engage readers' feelings. She included dialect and vernacular speech to give her characters distinctive voices. She interspersed her narrative with direct addresses to the reader, making moral arguments and appeals. This mixture of techniques made the novel accessible to a wide audience while conveying its serious message. The character of Uncle Tom himself represents Stowe's ideal of Christian virtue. Tom is patient, forgiving, and faithful even in the face of terrible suffering. He refuses to betray other slaves or to compromise his principles. He maintains his dignity and his faith until his death. Stowe intended Tom to be a heroic figure, a black Christ who redeems through his suffering. But this portrayal has been controversial. Some see Tom as too passive, too accepting of his oppression. Others argue that Stowe was working within the limits of what her white audience could accept and that she was trying to counter racist stereotypes of black violence and savagery. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived through enormous changes in American society. She was born when slavery was legal throughout the South and accepted by many in the North. She died when slavery had been abolished for 3 decades but when Jim Crow segregation and racial violence were creating a new system of oppression. She witnessed the transformation of America from a rural, agricultural society to an urban, industrial nation. She saw the rise of women's rights movements, labor movements, and progressive reform efforts. Her long life spanned much of the 19th century and its tumultuous social changes. Stowe's home in Hartford, now a museum, preserves her memory and her contributions to American literature and history. Visitors can see where she lived and worked, where she wrote her later novels and entertained friends and family. The house stands as a testament to her achievements and her place in American culture. It reminds us that literature can be a force for social change and that individual voices can make a difference in history. When Harriet Beecher Stowe died, she left behind a body of work that included novels, essays, sketches, and articles. She left behind a family that carried on her legacy of social engagement and moral conviction. Most importantly, she left behind Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that had helped end slavery and that continues to be read, studied, and debated. So Stowe was even in death the woman whose words had changed history. Angelina Grimke was a Southern aristocrat who became one of the most radical voices for abolition and women's rights in American history. Angelina Emily Grimke, the pioneering abolitionist and feminist, was born in Charleston, South Carolina on February 20, 1805. She came from a wealthy slaveholding family. She had a refined upbringing in the heart of the antebellum South. The Grimke family's wealth was built on the labor of enslaved people. They owned hundreds of slaves on their plantations. Angelina was homeschooled by private tutors, as was customary for daughters of the Southern elite. She received an education in literature, languages, and the social graces expected of a Charleston belle. But from an early age, Angelina questioned the institution of slavery that surrounded her. She witnessed the brutality and injustice of the system firsthand. The young Angelina was deeply troubled by what she saw. The Grimke household was dominated by their father, Judge John Fauchereau Grimke, a prominent attorney and slaveholder. He was a stern patriarch who believed firmly in the Southern way of life. Angelina's mother, Mary Smith Grimke, managed the household and upheld the social conventions of Charleston society. Angelina had 13 siblings, though several died in childhood. Her older sister Sarah became her closest confidant and eventual partner in reform. The two sisters would form an unbreakable bond that would sustain them through decades of activism. Charleston in the early 1800s was a city built on cotton, rice, and human bondage. The Grimke mansion stood as a symbol of Southern prosperity and power. But within its walls, young Angelina's conscience was awakening to the moral horror of slavery. As a teenager, Angelina converted to Presbyterianism, seeking spiritual answers to her growing discomfort with slavery. She became increasingly religious and began to see slavery as a sin against God. The church, however, disappointed her. Most Presbyterian churches in Charleston defended slavery or remained silent on the issue. Angelina found no support for her abolitionist leanings in the religious community of her hometown. She felt isolated and conflicted, trapped between her family's expectations and her own moral convictions. In 1829, at the age of 24, Angelina made a dramatic decision. She followed her sister Sarah north to Philadelphia to join the Society of Friends, the Quakers. The Quakers were among the few religious groups who openly opposed slavery. Leaving Charleston was an act of rebellion against everything Angelina had been raised to accept. She turned her back on Southern society, on the privilege of her birth, and on her family's slave-based wealth. Her family was shocked and dismayed by her departure. They saw it as a betrayal of their way of life. But for Angelina, it was a moral necessity. She could no longer live in complicity with a system she believed to be evil. Philadelphia in the 1830s was a center of reform movements. Abolitionists, temperance advocates, and women's rights activists gathered there to organize and agitate for change. Angelina threw herself into this world of activism with passionate intensity. In Philadelphia, Angelina joined the Female Anti-Slavery Society and began to educate herself on the abolitionist cause. She read William Lloyd Garrison's radical newspaper, The Liberator, which called for immediate emancipation of all slaves. Garrison was not interested in gradual abolition or colonization schemes. He demanded the immediate and complete end to slavery. His uncompromising stance resonated with Angelina. She had seen slavery up close. She knew it could not be reformed or made more humane. It had to be abolished entirely. In 1835, Angelina wrote a letter to Garrison praising his work and expressing her support for immediate abolition. Garrison published her letter in The Liberator without her permission. The publication of that letter changed Angelina's life forever. Suddenly, she was thrust into the public eye as a Southern woman who had turned against slavery. The letter caused a sensation. It was shocking enough that a woman would write publicly on political matters. But a Southern woman from a slave-holding family condemning slavery? That was unprecedented. Angelina's family in Charleston was horrified and humiliated. They disowned her. The mayor of Charleston sent her a warning that she would be arrested if she ever returned to the city. Angelina had burned her bridges with the South. There was no going back now. Emboldened by the response to her letter, Angelina decided to write more. In 1836, she published a pamphlet titled An Appeal to the Christian Women of the South. In it, she called on Southern women to recognize slavery as a sin and to work for its abolition. She urged them to speak out, to free any slaves they owned, and to use their moral influence to change their husbands' and fathers' hearts. The pamphlet was revolutionary. Angelina was asking women to take political action, to defy the laws of their states, and to challenge the authority of men. She was linking the cause of abolition with the cause of women's rights, though she may not have fully realized it at the time. Southern authorities were outraged by Angelina's appeal. Copies of the pamphlet were seized and burned by postmasters throughout the South. Any woman caught with a copy could face legal consequences. The pamphlet was considered dangerous and seditious. But in the North, it was widely read and discussed. Angelina Grimke had become a voice that could not be ignored. The abolitionist movement took notice of this brave Southern woman who was willing to speak truth to power. Theodore Weld, a prominent abolitionist leader, began corresponding with Angelina and Sarah, encouraging them to become public speakers for the cause. In 1836, Angelina took the radical step of addressing a group of women in a private parlor about abolition. This was controversial enough. Women did not speak in public forums. They were expected to remain in the domestic sphere, silent on political matters. But Angelina believed that slavery was a moral issue, and women had a duty to speak out on moral issues. Her talks to women's groups were so successful that the audiences grew larger and larger. Soon she was speaking to hundreds of women at a time. And then men began to attend her lectures as well. Angelina Grimke was becoming the first woman in America to address mixed audiences of men and women on political topics. The idea of a woman speaking to men was scandalous in the 1830s. It violated all social norms and religious teachings about women's proper place. The Congregational Clergy of Massachusetts issued a pastoral letter condemning the Grimke sisters for their public speaking. They warned that when women assumed the place and tone of men as public reformers, they threatened the social order and defied God's design. The criticism was fierce and unrelenting. Angelina and Sarah were called unwomanly, immodest, and dangerous. They were accused of being infidels and radicals who wanted to destroy society. Even some abolitionists thought the sisters had gone too far. They worried that linking abolition with women's rights would hurt the anti-slavery cause. But Angelina would not be silenced. She responded to her critics by writing another pamphlet, an appeal to the women of the nominally free states, in which she argued that Northern women bore responsibility for slavery too. The North benefited economically from slavery through trade and manufacturing. Northern churches remained silent or complicit. Northern women wore cotton produced by slave labor. Angelina called on all American women to recognize their complicity and to take action. She also began to articulate a philosophy of women's rights. If women had a moral duty to oppose slavery, then they must have the right to speak, to organize, and to petition the government. Women's rights and abolition were inseparable causes. In 1838, Angelina Grimke did something no American woman had ever done before. She addressed a committee of the Massachusetts state legislature on the subject of abolition. For 3 days, she testified before the legislative committee, presenting petitions signed by thousands of women calling for an end to slavery. The gallery was packed with spectators who came to witness this extraordinary event. A woman speaking before a governmental body was unheard of. Angelina spoke with eloquence and passion, drawing on her personal knowledge of slavery in the South. She described the cruelties she had witnessed, the families torn apart, the violence and degradation of the system. She argued that slavery corrupted both the enslaved and the enslaver. She called on the legislators to take action. The newspapers covered her testimony extensively. Some praised her courage and eloquence. Others condemned her for stepping so far outside woman's proper sphere. But everyone was talking about Angelina Grimke. She had proven that a woman could speak as effectively as any man on the great political questions of the day. Just days after her legislative testimony, Angelina married Theodore Weld, the abolitionist leader who had encouraged her speaking career. The wedding was a radical affair that reflected their egalitarian principles. Angelina refused to promise to obey her husband. Theodore renounced the legal rights that husbands had over their wives. They had a mixed-race wedding party, including several formerly enslaved people. It was a ceremony that embodied their vision of a more just and equal society. After her marriage, Angelina largely withdrew from public speaking. She was exhausted from years of constant travel and lecturing. She also became pregnant and focused on raising her 3 children. Some historians have criticized this withdrawal, seeing it as a retreat from her radical principles. But Angelina continued her activism in other ways. She and Theodore and Sarah all lived together in a communal household in New Jersey. They ran a school that admitted students regardless of race. They continued to write and organize for abolition. Angelina worked behind the scenes, supporting her husband's work and raising her children with anti-slavery principles. The 1840s and 1850s were decades of increasing sectional conflict over slavery. The Mexican-American War, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott decision all pushed the nation closer to civil war. Angelina watched these events with a mixture of hope and dread. She had been calling for immediate abolition since the 1830s. Now it seemed that only violence would end slavery. She supported the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln, though she thought they did not go far enough in their opposition to slavery. When the Civil War began in 1861, Angelina saw it as a divine judgment on America for the sin of slavery. During the Civil War, Angelina's household became a center of support for the Union cause. Theodore worked for the War Department. Angelina and Sarah raised money for the war effort and for aid to freed slaves. They welcomed soldiers and refugees into their home. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Angelina felt vindicated. Everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, had been for this moment. Slavery was ending. America was being reborn. But she also knew that emancipation was just the beginning. The freed people would need education, land, and political rights to truly be free. After the war, Angelina became involved in the women's suffrage movement. She had long argued that women needed political rights to be effective reformers. Now she joined with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in demanding the vote for women. The 15th Amendment, which gave voting rights to black men but not to women, created a painful split in the reform community. Some abolitionists argued that this was the Negro's hour and that women should wait for suffrage. Angelina disagreed. She believed that black women and all women deserved the vote immediately. She could not accept that the men she had fought alongside would now ask her to wait patiently for her own rights. In 1868, Angelina did something that shocked even her abolitionist friends. She discovered that her late brother Henry had fathered children with one of his slaves, Nancy Weston. These nephews, Archibald and Francis Grimke, were living in the South, struggling to get an education during Reconstruction. Angelina publicly acknowledged them as her nephews. She and Sarah welcomed them into their family and helped finance their education. Archibald and Francis both went on to become prominent ministers and civil rights leaders. Angelina's willingness to acknowledge her mixed-race nephews and to embrace them publicly was radical for its time. Many white families hid or denied such relationships. Angelina insisted on the truth and on family bonds that transcended race. The 1870s were difficult years for Angelina. Theodore's health declined, and the family faced financial struggles. Their school closed. They moved to the Boston area to be closer to the center of reform activity. Angelina suffered from chronic health problems, likely related to the exhausting pace of her earlier activist years. She could no longer speak in public or travel extensively. But she continued to write letters, to mentor younger activists, and to support the causes she believed in. She remained committed to abolition, women's rights, and racial equality until the end of her life. Angelina Grimke died on October 26, 1879, at the age of 74. She had lived to see slavery abolished, though she knew that true equality for black Americans was still far off. She had not lived to see women gain the vote, though she had helped lay the groundwork for that victory. Her funeral was attended by many of the leading reformers of the day. They praised her courage, her eloquence, and her unwavering commitment to justice. She was remembered as a woman who had sacrificed everything for her principles, who had defied her family, her region, and the social conventions of her time to speak truth to power. Angelina Grimke's legacy is complex and multifaceted. She was one of the first American women to speak publicly on political issues, paving the way for generations of women activists. She was one of the few white Southerners who not only opposed slavery but worked actively for its immediate abolition. She linked the causes of abolition and women's rights, recognizing that all forms of oppression were connected. She was willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about her own family and to work for racial reconciliation. Her writings and speeches influenced countless people and helped shape the abolitionist movement. But Angelina's story also reveals the limitations and contradictions of 19th-century reform movements. She was radical in many ways, but she still operated within a framework of Christian morality and Victorian values. She believed in moral suasion and appeals to conscience, strategies that proved insufficient to end slavery. Only war accomplished that. She withdrew from public life after marriage, suggesting that even the most radical women faced pressures to conform to domestic roles. And while she supported racial equality, she sometimes displayed the paternalism common among white abolitionists of her era. Angelina Grimke was not a perfect hero. She was a complex human being who struggled with doubts, health problems, and the limitations of her time. But she was also a woman of extraordinary courage and conviction. She gave up wealth, family, and social position to fight for what she believed was right. She spoke when women were expected to be silent. She challenged the most powerful economic and social system of her time. She refused to accept that injustice was inevitable or that change was impossible. In doing so, she helped change America. The Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah, working together, demonstrated the power of women's voices in shaping public discourse and political change. They showed that moral authority did not depend on gender or political power. They proved that one person, or two sisters, speaking truth could make a difference. Their example inspired generations of activists who followed. The suffragists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries looked back to the Grimke sisters as pioneers. The civil rights activists of the 1960s studied their tactics and their arguments. Contemporary feminists and anti-racist activists continue to draw inspiration from their work. Angelina Grimke lived in a time of tremendous upheaval and change. She was born into a world where slavery seemed permanent and women's subordination seemed natural and divinely ordained. She died in a world where slavery had been abolished and women were organizing for political rights. She helped bring about that change. Her life spanned the most transformative decades in American history, and she was not merely a witness to that transformation. She was an agent of it. She used her voice, her pen, and her personal example to challenge injustice and to advocate for a more equal and humane society. Today, Angelina Grimke is remembered as a pioneering abolitionist and feminist, a woman who broke barriers and defied conventions to fight for justice. Her writings are studied in courses on American history, women's history, and the history of social movements. Her speeches are analyzed as examples of powerful rhetoric and moral argument. Her life story is taught as an example of courage and commitment to principle. But perhaps most importantly, Angelina Grimke reminds us that change is possible, that individuals can make a difference, and that speaking out against injustice, even when it is difficult and dangerous, is both a moral duty and a path to transformation. She was a Southern aristocrat who became a radical reformer, a privileged daughter who sided with the oppressed, a woman who found her voice and used it to change the world. Theodore Weld was a passionate abolitionist and a powerful orator who became one of the most influential voices against slavery in America. Theodore Weld, the fiery anti-slavery crusader, was born in Hampton, Connecticut on November 23, 1803. He came from a prominent New England family with deep religious roots. His father was a Congregationalist minister, and young Theodore grew up steeped in the evangelical tradition that would shape his life's mission. Weld had a commanding presence and a voice that could move audiences to tears. His early years were marked by intellectual curiosity and spiritual searching. He was educated in the rigorous New England tradition, attending schools that emphasized classical learning and moral development. When he was a young man, Weld experienced a profound religious conversion that would set the course for his entire life. In the 1820s, Theodore Weld came under the influence of Charles Grandison Finney, the great revivalist preacher who was sweeping across upstate New York with his message of personal salvation and social reform. Finney's revivals were transforming communities, and Weld became one of his most devoted followers. The young man threw himself into evangelical work with tremendous energy and dedication. Weld was not content with merely preaching salvation for individual souls. He believed that true Christianity demanded action against social evils, particularly the great sin of slavery that was tearing at the moral fabric of the nation. Theodore Weld attended the Oneida Institute in New York, a manual labor school that combined practical work with academic study. This was a radical educational experiment for its time, breaking down barriers between intellectual and physical labor. At Oneida, Weld began to develop his ideas about social reform and the connection between religious faith and political action. He was a brilliant student with an intense personality that commanded respect from his peers and teachers alike. Weld's time at Oneida shaped his understanding of how education could be a tool for social transformation. In 1833, Theodore Weld enrolled at Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio. Lane was a new institution, and its president was Lyman Beecher, one of the most prominent religious figures in America. Cincinnati sat on the border between free and slave states, and the city was a crossroads where the tensions over slavery were impossible to ignore. Weld brought his anti-slavery convictions with him to Lane Seminary, and he quickly became the leader of a group of students who shared his views. These young men were not satisfied with abstract theological debates. They wanted to confront the reality of slavery directly. Theodore Weld organized a series of debates at Lane Seminary in 1834 that would become legendary in the anti-slavery movement. For 18 consecutive nights, students gathered to discuss the question of slavery and what should be done about it. Weld was the driving force behind these debates, and his oratory was mesmerizing. He presented evidence of slavery's cruelties, challenged the arguments of those who defended the institution, and called for immediate abolition. The Lane debates, as they became known, were a turning point in the anti-slavery movement. They demonstrated that young people were ready to take radical action against slavery. The students at Lane didn't just debate slavery in the abstract. They went into Cincinnati's black community, teaching in schools, visiting homes, and building relationships with free African Americans. This was shocking behavior for the time. White students socializing with black people as equals challenged every social convention of the era. The trustees of Lane Seminary were horrified by what was happening. They feared that the institution would be destroyed by controversy. President Lyman Beecher tried to navigate between the students and the trustees, but the situation was impossible to manage. The Lane trustees passed new rules forbidding anti-slavery activities and discussions on campus. Theodore Weld and his fellow students refused to submit to these restrictions. They believed that their Christian conscience demanded that they speak out against slavery, and no human authority could silence them. In what became known as the Lane Rebellion, Weld led a mass exodus of students from the seminary. Nearly 50 students left Lane rather than compromise their principles. This was an extraordinary act of defiance that sent shockwaves through the religious and educational establishment. The Lane Rebels, as they were called, needed a new home. They found it at Oberlin College in northern Ohio. Oberlin was a radical institution that welcomed the rebellious students and their anti-slavery convictions. The college agreed to admit students regardless of race, making it one of the first truly integrated institutions of higher education in America. Theodore Weld became the leader of what was essentially an anti-slavery training ground at Oberlin. He was preparing a generation of activists who would carry the abolitionist message across the North. In 1834, Theodore Weld was recruited by the American Anti-Slavery Society to become one of their agents. The society, led by wealthy philanthropists Arthur and Lewis Tappan, was organizing a systematic campaign to spread anti-slavery sentiment throughout the North. Weld was the perfect man for this mission. He had the religious conviction, the oratorical skill, and the personal charisma to move audiences. But Weld was not interested in fame or recognition. He insisted on working behind the scenes, training other agents and organizing campaigns rather than seeking the spotlight for himself. Theodore Weld developed a training program for anti-slavery agents that was revolutionary in its approach. He recruited 70 men, most of them from Lane Seminary and Oberlin College, and trained them in the techniques of anti-slavery agitation. Weld taught these agents how to organize meetings, how to answer objections, how to present evidence of slavery's cruelties, and how to appeal to people's moral sensibilities. These agents became known as the 70, and they fanned out across the northern states, holding meetings in churches, town halls, and public squares. They faced violent mobs, threats, and physical danger, but they persisted in their mission. Weld himself traveled throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, speaking against slavery. His speeches could last for hours, and audiences sat transfixed as he presented detailed evidence of slavery's horrors. Weld had done his research thoroughly. He collected testimonies from former slaves, advertisements for runaway slaves that described brutal punishments, and accounts from Southern newspapers that documented the violence of the slave system. He presented this evidence methodically, building an overwhelming case against slavery that was difficult to refute. Weld was not a ranting fanatic. He was calm, logical, and devastating in his arguments. Theodore Weld faced constant danger in his work. Pro-slavery mobs attacked his meetings, throwing stones and rotten eggs. He was threatened with violence and sometimes had to flee for his safety. In one town, a mob dragged him from the platform and beat him. But Weld never backed down. He believed that God had called him to this work, and no amount of persecution would stop him. His courage inspired other anti-slavery activists and demonstrated that the abolitionist cause was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The physical demands of constant travel and speaking took a terrible toll on Theodore Weld's health. By 1836, he had damaged his voice from speaking so frequently and so intensely. His throat was permanently injured, and he could no longer deliver the powerful speeches that had made him famous. This was a devastating blow for a man whose greatest gift was his oratory. But Weld refused to abandon the anti-slavery cause. If he could no longer speak, he would write. He would organize. He would work behind the scenes to build the movement. Theodore Weld moved to New York City and began working directly with the American Anti-Slavery Society's leadership. He became the organization's chief researcher and writer, producing pamphlets and materials that were distributed throughout the North. Weld was a meticulous researcher who believed in the power of facts to change minds. He spent countless hours in libraries, reading Southern newspapers, legal documents, and first-hand accounts of slavery. He was building an archive of evidence that would be used by anti-slavery activists for years to come. In 1838, Theodore Weld married Angelina Grimke, one of the most remarkable women in the anti-slavery movement. Angelina and her sister Sarah were from a wealthy South Carolina slaveholding family, but they had rejected their upbringing and become passionate abolitionists. The Grimke sisters were pioneering women's rights advocates who insisted that women had the right and duty to speak publicly against slavery. This was radical for the time, as respectable women were not supposed to address mixed audiences of men and women. Angelina Grimke was a powerful speaker in her own right, and her marriage to Theodore Weld united two of the most committed activists in the movement. Theodore Weld and Angelina Grimke, along with her sister Sarah, collaborated on one of the most important anti-slavery documents ever produced. In 1839, they published American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. This book was a compilation of evidence documenting the cruelties of slavery, drawn from Southern sources. Weld and the Grimke sisters spent months reading through thousands of Southern newspapers, extracting advertisements, court records, and first-hand accounts that revealed the brutal reality of slavery. The book presented this evidence without editorial comment, letting the facts speak for themselves. American Slavery as It Is became one of the most influential anti-slavery publications of the 19th century. It sold over 100,000 copies in its first year, an enormous number for that time. The book was read throughout the North, and it converted many people to the anti-slavery cause. Harriet Beecher Stowe later acknowledged that she kept a copy of American Slavery as It Is on her desk while writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that it was a major source for her novel. Theodore Weld's painstaking research had created a document that would shape the anti-slavery debate for decades. After their marriage, Theodore Weld and Angelina Grimke settled in New Jersey, where they started a school based on progressive educational principles. Weld believed deeply in education as a tool for social reform. The school, which they ran with Angelina's sister Sarah, emphasized critical thinking, moral development, and practical skills. Students were taught to question authority and think for themselves. The school attracted the children of reformers and intellectuals from across the North. It was a place where anti-slavery principles were lived out in daily practice, with students of different races learning together. Theodore Weld largely withdrew from public anti-slavery work during the 1840s and 1850s, focusing on his school and his family. Some historians have puzzled over this withdrawal, wondering why such a passionate activist would step back from the movement at such a critical time. But Weld had never sought fame or recognition. He had damaged his health in service to the cause, and he believed that others could now carry on the work he had started. Weld also became disillusioned with some of the factional disputes that were tearing apart the anti-slavery movement. He was more interested in practical work than in ideological battles. Despite his withdrawal from public activism, Theodore Weld continued to influence the anti-slavery movement through his writing and his connections. He maintained correspondence with leading abolitionists and politicians, offering advice and encouragement. Weld was consulted by anti-slavery congressmen who were fighting against the expansion of slavery into new territories. His research and his arguments were used in congressional debates. Weld preferred to work behind the scenes, shaping strategy and providing intellectual ammunition for others to use in the public arena. The 1850s were a decade of increasing crisis over slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required Northerners to assist in capturing escaped slaves, outraging anti-slavery sentiment. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened new territories to slavery, leading to violent conflict in Kansas. Theodore Weld watched these developments with deep concern. He had dedicated his life to ending slavery peacefully, through moral persuasion and political action. But the nation seemed to be moving inexorably toward violent confrontation. When the Civil War began in 1861, Theodore Weld saw it as both a tragedy and an opportunity. The war was a terrible judgment on the nation for the sin of slavery, but it also offered the possibility of finally ending the institution that he had fought against for so long. Weld supported the Union cause and urged President Lincoln to make emancipation a war aim. He was frustrated by Lincoln's initial caution on the slavery question, but he understood the political complexities the president faced. Weld believed that the war would not be won until it became explicitly a war to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was a moment of triumph for Theodore Weld and all the abolitionists who had worked for decades to end slavery. Weld had lived to see the cause to which he had dedicated his youth finally achieve victory. But the proclamation was only the beginning. The work of Reconstruction, of building a society where formerly enslaved people could live as free and equal citizens, was just beginning. Weld knew that the battle for racial justice would continue long after slavery itself was abolished. After the Civil War, Theodore Weld continued to be involved in education and reform causes. He moved to Massachusetts and remained active in progressive circles. Weld lived to see the passage of the 13th Amendment, which permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States. He also witnessed the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. These were victories that would have seemed impossible when Weld began his anti-slavery work in the 1830s. Theodore Weld's later years were marked by reflection on the long struggle against slavery and the work that remained to be done. He had sacrificed his health and his voice for the anti-slavery cause, but he had never sought recognition or reward. Weld was content to have played his part in one of the great moral struggles in American history. He remained committed to the principles that had guided his life, that all people were created equal, that slavery was a sin against God and humanity, and that Christians had a duty to work for justice. Angelina Grimke Weld died in 1879, and Theodore mourned the loss of his partner in life and in the anti-slavery struggle. They had been married for more than 40 years, and they had worked together to build a more just society. After Angelina's death, Theodore continued to live quietly in Massachusetts, maintaining connections with old friends from the anti-slavery movement and watching as the nation struggled with the legacy of slavery and the challenges of Reconstruction. Theodore Weld died on February 3, 1895, at the age of 91. He had lived through almost the entire 19th century, from the era of Thomas Jefferson to the age of industrialization and urbanization. Weld had witnessed the transformation of the anti-slavery movement from a small band of radicals to a powerful political force that had reshaped the nation. He had seen slavery abolished and had lived long enough to witness both the promise and the disappointments of Reconstruction. When Theodore Weld died, he was remembered by those who had known him as one of the greatest abolitionists of his generation. But because he had shunned publicity and worked behind the scenes, he was not as well known to the general public as figures like William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass. Weld had never cared about fame. He had cared about ending slavery and building a more just society. His legacy was in the countless lives he had touched, the activists he had trained, and the arguments he had crafted that helped to end the great evil of slavery. Theodore Weld's life demonstrates the power of moral conviction and sustained commitment to social change. He was willing to sacrifice his health, his comfort, and his personal ambitions for a cause he believed was right. Weld understood that ending slavery would require not just passionate speeches but careful organization, thorough research, and strategic thinking. He trained a generation of anti-slavery activists and provided them with the intellectual tools they needed to make their case to the American people. The story of Theodore Weld reminds us that social movements require both public leaders and behind-the-scenes organizers. Weld was content to work in the background, training others and providing them with research and arguments. He understood that the movement was larger than any individual and that lasting change required building institutions and developing strategies that could sustain the work over decades. Weld's approach to activism was both deeply religious and remarkably practical. He believed God had called him to fight slavery, but he also understood that effective activism required careful planning and organization. Theodore Weld's marriage to Angelina Grimke was itself a statement about the kind of society he hoped to build. Their partnership was based on equality and mutual respect, unusual for that era. Together they demonstrated that men and women could work as equals in the struggle for justice. The school they founded was an experiment in creating a community based on anti-slavery principles, where children of different races could learn together and where critical thinking was valued over rote memorization. The influence of Theodore Weld's work extended far beyond his own lifetime. American slavery as it is continued to be read and cited by historians and activists studying slavery. The arguments he developed and the evidence he compiled became part of the permanent record that documented slavery's cruelties. The agents he trained went on to become leaders in the Republican Party and in the fight for civil rights during Reconstruction. Weld's legacy lived on in the institutions he helped build and the people he inspired. Theodore Weld was a man of his time, shaped by the religious revivals and reform movements of the early 19th century. But his commitment to racial justice and human equality speaks across the generations. He recognized that slavery was not just a political or economic issue but a profound moral evil that corrupted American society. Weld dedicated his life to eradicating that evil, and he lived to see his life's work accomplished. In death, Theodore Weld left behind a legacy of courage, commitment, and the belief that individuals working together can transform society and bend the arc of history toward justice. David Walker was a free black man and radical abolitionist who became one of the most influential voices against slavery in American history. David Walker, author of The Revolutionary Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, was born free in Wilmington, North Carolina on September 28, 1796. He came from a mother who was free, and under the laws of the time, this meant David was born free despite his father being enslaved. He witnessed the brutal realities of slavery from his earliest days. Walker's experiences in the South were formative. He was educated, which was rare for black Americans at that time, whether free or enslaved. The young Walker traveled extensively throughout the South, and everywhere he went he saw the horrors of the slave system. He saw families torn apart, people beaten and degraded, human beings treated as property. These experiences burned into his consciousness and shaped his mission for the rest of his life. In the early 1820s, David Walker made a momentous decision. He could no longer bear to live in the South where slavery surrounded him. He left North Carolina and traveled north, eventually settling in Boston, Massachusetts in 1825. Boston was a center of free black life and abolitionist activity. Walker found a community there, but he never forgot what he had witnessed in the South. In Boston, Walker established himself as a used clothing dealer. He opened a shop on Brattle Street near the waterfront. This location was strategic, whether intentionally or not, because the waterfront brought Walker into contact with black sailors who traveled up and down the Atlantic coast. These sailors would become crucial to distributing his message. Walker quickly became active in Boston's black community. He was a man of deep religious conviction and intellectual curiosity. He joined the Methodist Church and became involved in various organizations dedicated to the welfare and advancement of Black Americans. Walker was a member of the Massachusetts General Colored Association, one of the first organizations in the nation dedicated to the abolition of slavery and the advancement of black rights. He was not content to simply live his own life in freedom while millions remained in bondage. Walker became a subscription agent for Freedom's Journal, the first black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States. Through this work, he stayed connected to the broader struggle for black liberation and kept his finger on the pulse of abolitionist thought. But David Walker was not satisfied with the cautious, gradualist approach that characterized much of the abolitionist movement in the 1820s. Many white abolitionists at the time favored colonization, the idea of sending Black Americans back to Africa rather than integrating them as equal citizens. Even some black leaders supported this approach, seeing no hope for true equality in America. Walker rejected colonization utterly. He believed that Black Americans had as much right to this country as anyone else. They had built it with their labor, watered its soil with their blood and tears. America was their home, and they deserved full citizenship and equality. Walker also grew frustrated with the moderate tone of the abolitionist movement. He believed that slavery was not just a moral wrong that could be gradually reformed away. It was a monstrous evil that demanded immediate action. He saw slavery as a system of violence, and he began to believe that violence might be necessary to end it. These were dangerous ideas in 1820s America. Even in the North, even in Boston, speaking openly about slave resistance and rebellion could bring severe consequences. But David Walker was not a man to be silenced by fear. In 1829, David Walker published his masterwork, a pamphlet that would shake the nation to its core. He called it Walker's Appeal, in 4 articles, together with a preamble, to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular, and very expressly, to those of the United States of America. It is commonly known simply as Walker's Appeal. This document was unlike anything that had come before in American abolitionist literature. It was not a polite petition to white Americans' better angels. It was not a patient argument for gradual emancipation. Walker's Appeal was a fiery, prophetic denunciation of slavery and a call to action for enslaved and free Black Americans alike. Walker's Appeal was divided into 4 articles, each addressing a different aspect of the condition of Black Americans. The first article dealt with slavery itself, calling it the most degrading and inhuman system ever devised. Walker compared American slavery unfavorably even to ancient systems of bondage, arguing that American slavery was uniquely cruel in its total dehumanization of its victims. The second article attacked ignorance and education, arguing that slaveholders deliberately kept black people ignorant to maintain control, and calling on Black Americans to educate themselves and their children. The third article focused on religion, condemning the hypocrisy of Christian slaveholders and calling out white ministers who used the Bible to justify slavery. The fourth article addressed colonization, that plan supported by many whites and some blacks to send free Black Americans to Africa, and Walker denounced it as a scheme to remove free blacks who might inspire the enslaved to resist. Throughout the appeal, Walker's language was biblical and prophetic. He invoked God's judgment on America for the sin of slavery. He warned that divine retribution was coming if the nation did not repent and abolish slavery immediately. But Walker did not only call on God to act. He also called on Black Americans themselves to resist their oppression by any means necessary. This was the most controversial and dangerous aspect of Walker's appeal. He explicitly told enslaved people that they had the right to kill their masters if that was what it took to gain their freedom. He wrote that it was better to die fighting for freedom than to live in degradation as slaves. He called on Black Americans to rise up, to refuse to submit, to claim their humanity and their rights. Walker was careful to say that he preferred peaceful means if possible. He was not bloodthirsty or violent by nature. But he was realistic about the nature of slavery. It was a system maintained by violence, and he believed that violence might be necessary to overthrow it. He asked white Americans to consider what they would do if they were enslaved. Would they not fight for their freedom? Why then should Black Americans be expected to submit passively? Walker's Appeal was a radical document that challenged not just slavery but the entire racial hierarchy of American society. He insisted on the full humanity and equality of black people. He rejected any notion of black inferiority. He argued that if black Americans seemed degraded, it was only because of the oppression they suffered, not because of any innate deficiency. The publication of Walker's Appeal sent shockwaves through the nation. Walker used his connections with black sailors to distribute the pamphlet throughout the South. Copies were sewn into the linings of coats that sailors wore into Southern ports. The pamphlet was smuggled into cities like Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, and New Orleans. When copies were discovered, Southern authorities reacted with panic and fury. This was exactly what they feared most, a call for slave rebellion coming from a free black man in the North. Southern states passed new laws restricting the movement of free blacks and the distribution of abolitionist literature. In some places, it became a crime even to possess a copy of Walker's Appeal. Authorities in the South put a price on Walker's head. According to some accounts, a reward of $3,000 was offered for Walker dead, and $10,000 for Walker alive. These were enormous sums at the time, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Southern authorities wanted Walker silenced, and they wanted to make an example of him. In the North, reaction was mixed. Some white abolitionists were horrified by Walker's militant language. They feared it would set back the cause of abolition by provoking a violent backlash. They preferred moral persuasion and gradual change. William Lloyd Garrison, who would become the most famous white abolitionist, had not yet begun publishing his newspaper The Liberator when Walker's Appeal appeared. But when Garrison did begin his work in 1831, he rejected Walker's call for violence while embracing his demand for immediate abolition. Other abolitionists, both black and white, were inspired by Walker's courage and his uncompromising stance. They saw that he was willing to speak truths that others were afraid to utter. David Walker was undeterred by the threats against him. Friends urged him to flee to Canada for his safety, but Walker refused. He said that someone had to be willing to take a stand, even at the cost of their own life. He revised and republished the appeal, releasing a second edition and then a third, each more forceful than the last. He continued his work in Boston, continuing to operate his shop, continuing to be active in the black community, continuing to spread his message. Walker knew he was in danger, but he would not be silenced. He believed his cause was righteous and that God was on his side. He was willing to become a martyr if that was what it took to advance the cause of freedom. On June 28, 1830, David Walker married a young woman named Eliza. It seemed that despite the danger surrounding him, Walker was looking toward the future, building a life. But that future would be tragically short. Just over a month later, on August 6, 1830, David Walker was found dead near the doorway of his shop on Brattle Street. He was only 33 years old. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. But many people, then and now, have suspected that Walker was murdered. The timing was too convenient. A man with a price on his head, a man who had defied the most powerful interests in the nation, suddenly dies of natural causes at a young age? Many in Boston's black community believed that Walker had been poisoned by Southern agents. No proof was ever found, and the truth of how David Walker died remains a mystery to this day. What is not a mystery is the impact of David Walker's life and work. Walker's Appeal became one of the most important documents in the history of American abolitionism. It represented a turning point, a moment when the abolitionist movement began to embrace more radical demands and tactics. Walker's insistence on immediate abolition, his rejection of colonization, his assertion of black equality, these positions would become central to the abolitionist movement in the 1830s and beyond. William Lloyd Garrison founded the Liberator newspaper in January 1831, just months after Walker's death, and Garrison's motto was immediate and complete emancipation. This was Walker's position. Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist and orator, would later acknowledge the influence of Walker's Appeal on his own thinking. Walker's Appeal also had a more immediate and dramatic impact. In August 1831, exactly 1 year after Walker's death, a slave named Nat Turner led the most significant slave rebellion in American history in Southampton County, Virginia. Turner and his followers killed nearly 60 white people before the rebellion was suppressed. Whether Turner had read Walker's appeal is uncertain, but the timing led many to draw a connection. Southern authorities certainly believed that documents like Walker's appeal inspired rebellions like Turner's. This led to even harsher restrictions on black literacy and movement throughout the South. David Walker's legacy extends beyond his immediate impact on the abolitionist movement. He represents a tradition of black radicalism and resistance that runs throughout American history. Walker refused to accept the gradualism and compromise that characterized much of the early abolitionist movement. He insisted that the enslaved had the right to fight for their freedom, that they were not obligated to wait patiently for white Americans to grant them their rights. He asserted black humanity and equality in the strongest possible terms, refusing to accept any notion of black inferiority. Walker also demonstrated the power of the written word as a weapon against oppression. His appeal was a text, a pamphlet, words on paper. But those words were so powerful, so dangerous to the slave system, that Southern authorities banned them and put a price on the author's head. Walker showed that ideas could be as threatening to an unjust system as guns or swords. In his personal life, Walker was known as a man of principle and courage. He was deeply religious, seeing his work as part of God's plan. He was educated and articulate, able to marshal powerful arguments against slavery and racism. He was also a man of action, not content to simply write and speak but working to distribute his message and build organizations. Walker was a community leader in Boston, respected and admired by those who knew him. He was a husband, though his marriage was tragically brief. He was a businessman, supporting himself through his own labor. He was all of these things, but above all, he was a freedom fighter, someone who dedicated his life to the liberation of his people. The question of violence in Walker's appeal remains controversial. Some see Walker as a prophet of justified resistance, arguing that enslaved people had every right to use violence to free themselves from a violent system. Others see his advocacy of violence as morally troubling, even while acknowledging the evil of slavery. This debate reflects broader questions about the role of violence in social change, questions that remain relevant today. What is clear is that Walker was not advocating violence for its own sake. He was responding to the violence of slavery itself, a system that was maintained through whipping, torture, rape, family separation, and murder. Walker was asking why enslaved people should be expected to submit to this violence without fighting back. Walker's rejection of colonization also deserves emphasis. The American Colonization Society, founded in 1816, promoted the idea of sending free black Americans to Africa, specifically to the colony of Liberia. Many prominent white Americans supported colonization, including some who opposed slavery. They believed that black and white Americans could never live together as equals, and that the solution was separation. Some free black Americans supported colonization as well, despairing of ever achieving equality in America. But Walker saw colonization for what it was, a way to remove free blacks who might inspire enslaved people to seek freedom, and a denial of black Americans' right to the country they had built. Walker insisted that America was as much the home of black Americans as white Americans, and that black Americans deserved full citizenship and equality right here. David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world was reprinted and circulated for decades after his death. It influenced generations of black activists and thinkers. In the 20th century, scholars and activists rediscovered Walker's appeal and recognized its importance. Walker came to be seen as a forerunner of later black radical traditions, from Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X to the Black Power movement. His insistence on black pride, his rejection of white supremacy, his willingness to consider militant resistance, these themes would echo through black freedom struggles for generations. Walker's life was short, but his impact was profound and lasting. The city of Boston, where Walker lived and died, has recognized his significance. There is a memorial to David Walker on Beacon Hill, near where he lived and worked. The inscription honors him as a pioneering abolitionist and civil rights activist. But for many years, Walker was a forgotten figure, overshadowed by later abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. This forgetting was not accidental. Walker's radicalism made him a controversial figure, and there were those who preferred to remember the abolitionist movement as more moderate and less threatening than it actually was. Recovering Walker's story means acknowledging the full range of abolitionist thought and tactics, including the militant resistance that Walker advocated. When David Walker died in 1830, slavery still had more than 30 years to run in the United States. It would take a civil war, costing more than 600,000 lives, to finally end slavery. Walker did not live to see emancipation, did not live to see his prophecies of divine judgment on America for the sin of slavery come to pass in the form of that bloody war. But his words helped prepare the ground for that eventual reckoning. He was one of the voices crying out in the wilderness, warning that a nation built on slavery could not stand, that justice delayed would eventually demand a terrible price. In the end, David Walker was proven right, though the cost of that vindication was higher than anyone could have imagined. David Walker remains a challenging and inspiring figure. He challenges us to consider what we would be willing to sacrifice for justice, what risks we would take to fight oppression. He inspires us with his courage, his eloquence, his uncompromising commitment to freedom and equality. He lived only 33 years, but in that short life he made a mark on history that endures to this day. David Walker was a free black man who could have lived quietly, enjoying his own freedom while ignoring the plight of the enslaved. Instead, he chose to speak out, to take risks, to fight for the freedom of all his people. He paid for that choice with his life, but his words and his example lived on, inspiring others to continue the struggle. David Walker was, even in death, a voice for freedom that could not be silenced.